Everyone in Bozeman knew Tom Anderson. The man who cleared snow from driveways every winter morning, who grilled burgers at church picnics, who never married but always smiled. On that terrible winter night in 2005, when 23-year-old nurse Sarah Mitchell vanished, Tom was at the front of the volunteer search teams. For 19 years, the secret remained buried beneath Montana's frozen ground. Until genetic genealogy technology linked DNA from under Sarah's fingernails to Tom's cousin. No one had suspected him for even a moment. Because in Montana, trusting your neighbor is part of survival. December 14, 2005. The temperature in Bozeman, Montana hovered at -12 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that turns breath into ice crystals before they hit the ground. Sarah Mitchell finished her evening shift at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital at 11:47 p.m., her badge swipe recorded by the security system. She pulled her navy blue parka tight, waved goodnight to the security guard, and walked across the near-empty parking lot to her silver Honda Civic. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows on the fresh snow. Her footprints were the only marks disturbing the white surface. Sarah was 23 years old, a pediatric nurse who'd grown up in Great Falls before moving to Bozeman for work 2 years earlier. She lived in a modest rental house on the south side of town, a small 2-bedroom place she shared with her orange tabby cat, Milo. Her mother, Patricia Mitchell, described her as responsible, punctual, and devoted to her patients. Sarah called home every Sunday without fail. She never missed a shift. She always texted her roommate from nursing school, Jenny, when she got home safely from late shift. That night, the text never came. Sarah's planned route home was simple and direct. South on 19th Avenue, then west on Kagi Boulevard, a total drive of about 12 minutes in good weather. But her silver Civic never made it to her driveway. At 6:47 a.m. the next morning, a rancher named Dale Hutchins was driving his pickup truck along a remote stretch of Bridger Canyon Road, nearly 15 miles north of the hospital, when he spotted something odd. A car sat idling on the shoulder, exhaust puffing white clouds into the frozen dawn air. Its headlights were still on, battery draining. The driver's door hung open. Dale pulled over, his boots crunching on packed snow as he approached. The Honda's engine was running, heat blasting from the vents. Keys dangled from the ignition. A purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside, $63 in cash untouched. Sarah's phone lay on the center console, battery at 18%. A half-empty coffee cup from the hospital cafeteria sat in the cup holder, still faintly warm. But Sarah Mitchell was gone. Dale called 911 at 6:52 a.m. Within 20 minutes, Gallatin County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene. What they found painted a deeply troubling picture. Sarah's footprints led from the driver's side door about 30 feet into the snow-covered field adjacent to the road, then stopped abruptly. No other footprints were visible. No signs of a struggle in the immediate area. No blood, no torn clothing, no indication of what had happened. The snow around the car was largely undisturbed except for Sarah's tracks and now those of the first responders. Inside the vehicle, deputies found Sarah's winter coat draped across the back seat. In Montana, in December, no one willingly leaves their car without a coat when it's 12 below zero. Her hospital ID badge was clipped to her scrubs. Her boots, heavy-duty winter boots suitable for Montana weather, were still on her feet based on the print. Everything suggested she'd stopped the car herself, left it running, stepped out, and walked into the field. But why? And where did she go after those 30 feet? Lead investigator Detective Marcus Reeves arrived at the scene at 7:45 a.m. A 22-year veteran of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, Reeves had seen his share of missing persons cases in Montana's vast wilderness. But something about this scene felt wrong to him immediately. The location made no sense. Bridger Canyon Road was nowhere near Sarah's route home. To get there from the hospital, she would have had to drive north instead of south, adding nearly 20 miles to her commute. There was no rational reason for Sarah to be on that road at that hour. This wasn't a wrong turn, Reeves told his partner, Deputy Linda Cho. This was a detour, either voluntary or forced. Search and rescue teams were mobilized by 9 a.m. Volunteers from Gallatin County Search and Rescue, equipped with winter gear and search dogs, began combing the area around where Sarah's car was found. The terrain was challenging, rolling hills covered in deep snow, scattered pine forests, and numerous ravines where a person could easily become hidden. Temperatures remained brutally cold, never rising above 5 degrees that day. If Sarah was out there, exposure would be the primary concern. The search dogs picked up Sarah's scent from the car and followed it to where her footprints ended, then lost the trail. This baffled the handlers. Dogs could typically track a scent through snow for considerable distances. The abrupt end suggested either Sarah had been picked up at that point, or something had disrupted the scent trail. Neither explanation was comforting. By late afternoon on December 15th, word of Sarah's disappearance had spread through Bozeman like wildfire. In a city of just over 30,000 people at the time, everyone knew someone who knew Sarah. The hospital where she worked was in shock. Her co-workers described her as dedicated, kind, and utterly reliable. Sarah would never just leave, said Dr. Rachel Simmons, the pediatrician Sarah worked most closely with. She loved those kids. She loved her job. This doesn't make sense. Patricia Mitchell drove the 3 hours from Great Falls to Bozeman in a state of growing panic. She'd last spoken to Sarah 2 days earlier, on December 13th, their regular midweek call. Sarah had been cheerful, talking about Christmas plans, asking what her mother wanted as a gift. There had been no indication anything was wrong, no mention of problems at work or in her personal life. Patricia went to Sarah's rental house and found Milo, the cat, crying pitifully, his food and water bowls empty. Sarah would never have left him like that. The first 48 hours of any missing persons case are critical. Detective Reeves and his team worked around the clock, interviewing everyone who'd seen Sarah in the days before her disappearance. Coworkers confirmed she'd seemed normal during her shift on December 14th. The security guard who saw her leave the hospital described her as appearing tired but not distressed. No one reported seeing her interact with anyone suspicious or unusual. Investigators pulled Sarah's phone record. Her last outgoing text had been at 11:52 p.m., sent to her friend Jenny. "Leaving now, see you tomorrow." There were no calls or texts after that. Her last incoming call had been at 7:13 p.m., from her mother, which Sarah had answered during her dinner break. Cell tower data showed Sarah's phone traveling south on 19th Avenue from the hospital, exactly as expected. Then, at approximately 12:03 a.m., the phone's trajectory changed. Instead of continuing toward her home, it turned north, heading up Bridger Canyon Road. This was the critical question. Why did Sarah change course? Reeves considered several possibilities. Perhaps she'd received a call or text that caused her to detour, but there was no record of such communication. Perhaps she'd decided to drive around to clear her head, though that seemed unlikely given the late hour and extreme cold. Or perhaps someone had been in her car, forcing her to drive to that remote location. But there were no signs of forced entry into her vehicle, and the hospital security cameras showed Sarah getting into her car alone. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. By December 16th, hundreds of volunteers had joined the search efforts. Tom Anderson was among them. Tom, 52 years old, lived just 2 houses down from Sarah's rental. He was a familiar figure in the neighborhood, a semi-retired contractor who did odd jobs for neighbors, cleared snow from driveways without being asked, and attended the same small Baptist church Sarah occasionally visited. When Patricia Mitchell met Tom during the search, he embraced her, tears in his eyes, and promised they'd find Sarah. "She's a good girl," Tom told Patricia. "The whole neighborhood loves her. We're not going to stop looking." For 5 days, search teams scoured an ever-widening radius from where Sarah's car was found. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew over the area, looking for any heat signature that might indicate a person. Divers checked nearby ponds and streams, breaking through ice to search the frigid water below. Local ranchers opened their properties to search teams, allowing them to check barns, sheds, and outbuildings. Nothing was found. On December 19th, a winter storm moved through the area, dumping 18 inches of fresh snow and forcing the suspension of search operations. When teams resumed on December 21st, any remaining physical evidence had been buried. Footprints, scent trails, anything that might have provided a clue was now hidden beneath a pristine white blanket. The window for finding Sarah alive, already narrow in Montana's winter, had effectively closed. Detective Reeves shifted the investigation's focus from search and rescue to criminal investigation. If Sarah hadn't wandered off and succumbed to exposure, then what had happened to her? He began looking at Sarah's personal life more closely. Did she have any enemies? Had she been involved in any disputes? Was there anyone who might want to harm her? The answers were frustratingly mundane. Sarah's life was, by all accounts, uncomplicated. She had no known enemies. She wasn't dating anyone seriously, having broken up with a boyfriend from nursing school over a year earlier, and that relationship had ended amicably. She had no significant debts, no legal troubles, no involvement in anything that might put her at risk. Her social media presence was minimal and unremarkable, mostly photos of Milo and Montana landscape. She was, in every way, an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life. But someone had caused Sarah to drive to Bridger Canyon Road that night. Reeves was certain of it. He began looking at people in Sarah's orbit who might have had the opportunity and means. Hospital staff were interviewed and re-interviewed. Patients Sarah had recently treated were checked, looking for anyone who might have developed an inappropriate fixation. Sarah's neighbors were questioned about whether they'd seen anything unusual on the night of December 14th or in the days leading up to it. Tom Anderson was interviewed on December 22nd. The interview was routine, part of the canvassing of Sarah's neighborhood. Tom told deputies he'd been home alone that night, had gone to bed around 10 p.m., and hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. He said he'd noticed Sarah's porch light was still on when he woke up the next morning, which struck him as odd since Sarah was usually conscientious about turning it off, but he'd assumed she'd simply forgotten. He seemed genuinely distraught about Sarah's disappearance and eager to help in any way possible. Nothing about Tom raised red flags. His account was consistent with what other neighbors had said. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket. He'd lived in that house for over 15 years, was well liked in the community, and had no known connection to Sarah beyond being a friendly neighbor. Reeves noted the interview in his file and moved on. Christmas 2005 was a somber affair in Bozeman. Sarah's face was on flyers in every shop window, on telephone poles throughout the city, on the news every night. Candlelight vigils were held at the hospital and at Sarah's church. Patricia Mitchell made tearful appeals on local television, begging anyone with information to come forward. But as days turned into weeks with no breaks in the case, a grim reality settled over the investigation. Sarah Mitchell was presumed dead, though her body had not been found. By January 2006, active search operations had ceased. The case remained open, but with no new leads and no physical evidence, there was little for investigators to pursue. Detective Reeves kept the file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, hoping something would click. But nothing did. Sarah Mitchell became another name in the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office cold case files, another unsolved disappearance in Montana's vast wilderness. Patricia Mitchell never stopped searching. Every weekend, she drove from Great Falls to Bozeman, walking the trails around Bridger Canyon Road, posting new flyers, talking to anyone who would listen. She kept Sarah's rental house for 6 months, unable to bear the thought of clearing out her daughter's belongings, before finally, reluctantly, packing everything into storage. She took Milo home to Great Falls, where the cat lived another 7 years, sleeping every night on what had been Sarah's childhood bed. The years passed slowly for Patricia. Birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, each was a fresh wound. She attended support groups for families of missing persons, finding some comfort in sharing her grief with others who understood. She maintained a website dedicated to Sarah's case, updating it regularly with information and appeals for tips. She never remarried, never moved from the house where Sarah had grown up, holding on to the irrational hope that somehow, someday, Sarah might come home. In Bozeman, life moved on. The city continued to grow, transforming from a modest college town into a booming hub for outdoor enthusiasts and remote workers. Property values skyrocketed. New restaurants and breweries opened. The hospital where Sarah had worked expanded, adding new wings and departments. Most people forgot about the nurse who'd vanished that December night. But a few remembered. Detective Reeves, who retired in 2012, kept a copy of Sarah's case file at home. And Tom Anderson, still living in the same house, still clearing snow and grilling burgers at church picnics, remembered too. Tom Anderson's life appeared unchanged by Sarah's disappearance. He continued his routine, his quiet existence in the modest house he'd purchased in 1990. He never married, though neighbors occasionally speculated about why such a nice man had remained single. He dated occasionally, casual relationships that never seemed to go anywhere. He was content with his own company, or so it seemed. He tended his small garden in summer, shoveled snow in winter, and attended church most Sundays. But Tom had a secret, one he'd carried for 19 years. The weight of it never seemed to affect his easy smile or his willingness to help neighbors with small repairs. He slept soundly at night, cooked himself simple meals, watched football on Sundays during the season. To anyone watching, Tom Anderson was exactly what he appeared to be, a middle-aged bachelor living a simple, harmless life. In 2018, a breakthrough in another case would eventually crack Sarah Mitchell's disappearance wide open. The Golden State Killer case in California was solved using a revolutionary technique called investigative genetic genealogy. Law enforcement had taken DNA from old crime scenes and uploaded it to public genealogy databases, finding distant relatives of the killer and building a family tree to identify him. The technique's success sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide and reignited hope for cold cases that had seemed unsolvable. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, under new leadership, launched a cold case initiative in 2019. Detective Sarah Chen, a young investigator with a background in forensic science, was assigned to review old files and identify cases that might benefit from new technologies. The Sarah Mitchell case was near the top of her list. Chen requested all physical evidence from the case be sent for re-examination. The evidence was minimal. Sarah's car had long since been returned to her mother, who'd eventually sold it, unable to bear the sight of it. But stored in the evidence room was a small collection of items from the crime scene. Swabs taken from the steering wheel, door handle, and seat, a few fiber samples, and most critically, scrapings taken from under Sarah's fingernails during a cursory examination of her personal effects from her house. In 2005, this material had been tested using the technology available at the time, which required relatively large DNA samples. The tests had produced no useful result. But in 2019, DNA analysis had evolved dramatically. Labs could now extract usable profiles from touch DNA, skin cells left behind from mere contact. The samples were sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. In March 2024, nearly 19 years after Sarah's disappearance, Parabon called Detective Chen with stunning news. They'd developed a DNA profile from the fingernail scrapings, and it didn't belong to Sarah Mitchell. The profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily submit their DNA results to find relatives. Within days, Parabon's team had identified several distant relatives of the person whose DNA was under Sarah's fingernails. They began building a family tree, working backward through generations, following branches, eliminating possibilities. The process took 3 months of painstaking research, cross-referencing public records, obituaries, census data, and birth certificates. On June 12, 2024, Parabon's genealogist sent Detective Chen a report with a name. Thomas James Anderson, born 1953, resident of Bozeman, Montana. He was a fourth cousin to one of the DNA matches in the database. The genetic genealogy was clear. The DNA under Sarah Mitchell's fingernails belonged to someone in Tom Anderson's immediate family. Given Tom's age and the local connection, he was the prime suspect. Chen felt her hands trembling as she read the report. She pulled up the original case file and found the interview notes from December 22, 2005. Tom Anderson, neighbor, interviewed routinely. No red flags. She looked at the photo attached to the file, a department snapshot from the neighborhood canvas. Tom's friendly face stared back at her, the same face that had been at the front of search parties, the same face that had comforted Patricia Mitchell. The investigation shifted into high gear, but carefully, quietly. Chun couldn't arrest Tom based solely on genetic genealogy, not yet. She needed to confirm the DNA match with a direct sample from Tom himself, and she needed to build a case explaining how his DNA came to be under Sarah's fingernails. She began surveillance, watching Tom's movements, looking for an opportunity to obtain his DNA discardantly, items he might throw away that could be tested without his knowledge. Tom Anderson's routine was predictable. He went to the same grocery store every Wednesday morning, had coffee at the same diner every Saturday, attended church on Sundays. On June 19, 2024, Detective Chen watched Tom order a large coffee at the diner and sit in his usual booth by the window. When he left 40 minutes later, Chen waited until the server cleared his table, then approached. She identified herself quietly and asked if she could have the coffee cup Tom had been drinking from. The server, wide-eyed but cooperative, handed it over in a plastic bag. The cup was rushed to the state crime lab. DNA extraction from the saliva on the rim produced a perfect match to the DNA from under Sarah Mitchell's fingernails. After 19 years, they had their man. On June 25, 2024, Detective Chun and 4 other officers executed a search warrant at Tom Anderson's house. Tom answered the door in sweatpants and a faded Montana State University t-shirt, clearly confused by the presence of so many police. "What's this about?" he asked, that same friendly smile flickering uncertainly. "Mr. Anderson, we need you to come with us," Chun said, her voice level and professional. "We have some questions about Sarah Mitchell." For just a moment, something changed in Tom's expression. The smile dropped. His eyes, which had been crinkled with confusion, went flat and cold. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. "Sarah? Of course, anything I can do to help. I still think about that poor girl." Tom was taken to the sheriff's office while forensic teams tore through his house. What they found would make Patricia Mitchell's worst nightmares seem tame. In the basement, hidden behind a false wall in Tom's workshop, investigators discovered a small room, no more than 8 by 10 feet. The walls were concrete. There was a drain in the floor. Hooks had been bolted into the ceiling. And on a shelf, carefully organized and labeled plastic bins, were items that clearly didn't belong to Tom. Jewelry, including a small silver bracelet engraved with the name Sarah, clothing, a nursing badge, and dozens of photographs. The photographs were of women. Some appeared to be candid shots taken without the subject's knowledge. Others were clearly taken in that basement room, women bound, terrified, looking at the camera. Sarah Mitchell was in several photos, her face frozen in fear, her wrists showing marks from restraints. Investigators counted photos of 12 different women spanning what appeared to be decades. Detective Chun felt sick as she sorted through the evidence. How many victims were there? How long had Tom been doing this? She called in the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, to cross-reference missing persons cases in Montana and surrounding states. Over the next several days, the scope of Tom Anderson's crimes became horrifyingly clear. In the interrogation room, Tom said nothing. He invoked his right to an attorney and refused to answer any questions. But the evidence spoke for him. DNA testing of items from the basement room confirmed Sarah Mitchell had been there. So had at least 3 other women whose cases had been reported as missing persons in Montana and Wyoming over the past 20 years. Most had been assumed to have become lost in Montana's wilderness, tragic accidents in an unforgiving landscape. Now it was clear they'd met a far more sinister fate. On June 27, 2024, Detective Chun drove to Great Falls to deliver the news to Patricia Mitchell in person. Patricia, now 78 years old, her hair white, her face deeply lined with years of grief, opened the door and knew immediately why the detective had come. She'd received calls over the years from investigators working Sarah's case, but something about this visit felt different. "You found her," Patricia said, not quite a question. "We found who took her," Chen replied gently. "I think you should sit down, Mrs. Mitchell." Patricia listened as Chen explained everything. The DNA match, Tom Anderson, the basement room, the photographs. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. When Chen finished, there was a long silence. Then Patricia asked the only question that mattered. "Where is Sarah? Where is my daughter's body?" That was the one answer Chen couldn't provide. Despite extensive searches of Tom Anderson's property and surrounding areas, despite ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, Sarah Mitchell's remains had not been found. Tom wasn't talking, and without his cooperation, they might never know where Sarah was buried. It was a final cruelty, denying Patricia even the closure of laying her daughter to rest. The arrest of Tom Anderson made national news. "Trusted neighbor accused in decades-old disappearance," read the headline in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. "Montana man charged in connection with multiple missing persons cases," announced CNN. The community of Bozeman was in shock. People who'd known Tom, who'd had him fix their porches and repair their fences, who'd eaten burgers he'd grilled at church, couldn't reconcile the smiling neighbor with the monster described in news reports. Former neighbors came forward with stories that, in hindsight, seemed chilling. One woman recalled how Tom had insisted on helping her carry groceries into her house even when she'd said she could manage. Another remembered Tom showing up at her door late one evening, claiming he'd seen someone suspicious in the neighborhood and wanted to make sure she was safe. At the time, these had seemed like acts of kindness. Now they felt like a predator testing boundaries, looking for vulnerabilities. The trial began in September 2024. Tom Anderson was charged with first-degree murder in Sarah Mitchell's death, though her body had not been found. Montana law allows for murder charges without a body if sufficient circumstantial evidence exists, and the prosecution had plenty. The DNA under Sarah's fingernails, the photographs, the items from the basement room, and testimony from forensic experts explaining how the physical evidence aligned with a kidnapping and murder scenario. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. On the night of December 14, 2005, Tom had been lying in wait for Sarah when she returned from her shift. He'd somehow forced his way into her car, perhaps approaching as she was unlocking it in the hospital parking lot, perhaps hiding in the back seat. He directed her to drive to the remote location on Bridger Canyon Road, where his own vehicle was likely parked. He'd forced her out of her car, leaving it running to make it appear she'd stopped voluntarily. Then he'd taken her, likely in his truck, to his house, where he'd held her in the basement room. Sarah had fought. The DNA under her fingernails proved that. She'd scratched him, drawn blood, left evidence that 19 years later would seal his fate. But it hadn't saved her. At some point, Tom had killed her and disposed of her body in a location that had so far evaded discovery. The prosecution suggested several wilderness areas where remains might be hidden, but without Tom's confession, finding Sarah was proving impossible. The defense's strategy was to challenge the DNA evidence and argue the prosecution's case was purely circumstantial. Yes, Tom's DNA was under Sarah's fingernails, but that could have occurred through innocent contact. They'd been neighbors. Perhaps Sarah had borrowed a tool from Tom, or Tom had helped her with something at her house. The photographs and items in the basement were disturbing, the defense admitted, but without Sarah's body, without a definitive cause of death, how could you prove murder? But the prosecution had more. They'd found Sarah's fingerprints in Tom's basement, on the concrete walls, smeared in patterns consistent with someone clawing, trying to escape. They'd found traces of Sarah's blood, minute amounts that had soaked into the concrete floor despite Tom's efforts to clean. And they'd found Sarah's DNA on the restraints that had been hanging from the ceiling hook. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. On October 15, 2024, after deliberating for 8 hours, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful restraint. Tom Anderson showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, his face blank. Patricia Mitchell, seated in the front row of the courtroom gallery, wept quietly, her face in her hands. Sentencing was scheduled for November 1, 2024. Under Montana law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. But before sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Patricia Mitchell stood before the court, leaning heavily on a cane, and addressed Tom Anderson directly for the first and only time. "You took my daughter from me," Patricia said, her voice shaking but clear. "You took her life, her future, everything she could have been. You took 19 years of my life, years I spent searching, hoping, praying for answers. And even now, you won't tell me where she is. You won't let me bring her home. You won't let me bury my child. That's a cruelty I will never understand and will never forgive." Tom Anderson didn't react. He stared at the table in front of him, his face expressionless. If Patricia's words affected him at all, he gave no sign. The judge sentenced Tom Anderson to life in prison without parole for Sarah Mitchell's murder, plus additional consecutive sentences for the kidnapping and unlawful restraint charges. He was immediately transferred to Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, where he would spend the rest of his life. He was 71 years old. The investigation into Tom Anderson's other potential victims continued. The FBI's VICAP team was cross-referencing the photographs found in his basement with missing persons cases across the western United States. Several families were contacted and asked to provide DNA samples for comparison with evidence from Tom's house. The work was painstaking and ongoing, a process that could take years to complete. In December 2024, exactly 19 years after Sarah Mitchell disappeared, Patricia Mitchell returned to Bozeman for a memorial service at the hospital where Sarah had worked. The hospital had established a scholarship in Sarah's name for nursing students, a small way to honor her memory and keep her dedication to caring for others alive. Patricia, frail but determined, spoke to the gathered crowd of hospital staff, former colleagues of Sarah's, and community members who'd never forgotten the young nurse who'd vanished. "Sarah loved being a nurse," Patricia said. "She loved helping people, especially children. She made them laugh even when they were scared or in pain. That's how I want her to be remembered. Not as a victim, but as someone who gave everything she had to making other people's lives better. Tom Anderson took her from us, but he didn't take that. Her kindness, her compassion, the lives she touched, those are eternal." The community of Bozeman has been forever changed by Sarah Mitchell's case and the revelation of Tom Anderson's crimes. It shattered the small town's sense of safety, the assumption that neighbors could be trusted simply because they were familiar. Parents now thought twice before letting their children help Mr. Anderson next door with yard work. People were more cautious, more vigilant, more aware that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. But the case also demonstrated something important about justice. For 19 years, Sarah Mitchell's case had been cold, seemingly unsolvable. The investigation had stalled, evidence had grown old, hope had faded. But advances in forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, had breathed new life into cold cases across the country. What had been impossible in 2005 became possible in 2024. Sarah's killer was brought to justice not through traditional detective work alone, but through the intersection of cutting-edge science and determined investigators who refused to let her case be forgotten. Detective Sarah Chern reflected on this during a later interview about the case. "We owe Sarah Mitchell justice," Chern said. "We owe all victims justice, no matter how much time has passed. The technology we used to catch Tom Anderson didn't exist when Sarah disappeared. But we held on to that evidence, preserved it, kept her case file active. And when the technology caught up, we were ready. That's the message I want other families of missing persons to hear. We don't give up. We never give up." Patricia Mitchell died in February 2025, just 4 months after Tom Anderson's conviction, at the age of 79. Friends said she'd held on long enough to see justice for Sarah, but once that battle was won, her body simply gave out. She was buried in Great Falls, next to an empty plot she'd purchased years earlier, meant for Sarah. The headstone reads, "Patricia and Mitchell, beloved mother, and Sarah Jane Mitchell, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. Sarah's body has never been found. Despite Tom Anderson's conviction, despite multiple attempts by prosecutors and investigators to negotiate with him, offering reduced sentences on other potential charges in exchange for revealing where Sarah's remains were hidden, Tom remained silent. He gave no cooperation, no closure to Patricia before she died. This final act of cruelty was perhaps the most telling insight into who Tom Anderson truly was. Not the friendly neighbor who grilled burgers and cleared snow, but a person capable of inflicting pain even after losing everything. The case of Sarah Mitchell and Tom Anderson raises profound questions about trust, about the masks people wear, about how well we truly know the people around us. Tom lived among his neighbors for decades, participated in community events, helped people with home repairs, attended church. He was, by all outward appearances, exactly the kind of person you'd want living on your street. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior was something monstrous. Psychologists who studied the case noted that Tom Anderson fit the profile of what's called a successful psychopath. Someone able to integrate into society, maintain relationships, and avoid detection for extended period. These individuals often lead double lives, presenting a normal face to the world while secretly engaging in criminal behavior. They're skilled at reading social cues, mimicking appropriate emotions, and maintaining the facade of normalcy. Tom's ability to comfort Patricia Mitchell, to stand alongside search teams looking for Sarah while knowing exactly where she was, required a level of emotional detachment that most people can't comprehend. The neighborhood where Sarah and Tom lived has changed. Several families moved away after Tom's arrest, unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened just doors away from their own homes. The house Tom owned was eventually seized by the county, sold at auction, and demolished. The property remains an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, a physical reminder of the horror that unfolded there. No one wants to build on that land or live in a house constructed where Sarah Mitchell spent her final hours. But Sarah's legacy extends beyond the tragedy of her death. The nursing scholarship established in her name has helped 6 students complete their education so far. Each year, a scholarship recipient visits Sarah's memorial plaque at the hospital, laid at the entrance to the pediatric ward where she worked, and leaves flowers. The tradition has become a way for new generations of nurses to connect with Sarah's memory and remember why they entered the profession, to help others, to ease suffering, to bring light into dark places. The technology that solved Sarah's case continues to evolve. Genetic genealogy has now been used to solve dozens of cold cases across the United States, including several other cases in Montana. The technique has limitations and raises privacy concerns about the use of genetic information from public databases, but its effectiveness is undeniable. For families who've waited decades for answers, it represents hope that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. In Bozeman, December 14th is now informally recognized as Sarah Mitchell Memorial Day. It's not an official holiday, but many in the community take a moment that day to remember Sarah and all victims of violence. The local domestic violence shelter hosts an annual vigil where names of victims are read aloud, candles are lit, and community members gather in solidarity. Sarah's name is always read first, a reminder of how her case galvanized efforts to address violence against women and improve law enforcement responses to missing persons cases. The investigation into Tom Anderson's other victims continues. As of this writing, investigators have definitively linked him to 4 additional missing women: Jennifer Hartley, who disappeared in 2001 from Missoula; Rebecca Tanner, who vanished in 2008 from Great Falls; Amanda Price, missing since 2012 from Helena; and Crystal Begay, a member of the Blackfeet Nation who disappeared from Browning in 2015. All 5 cases shared similarities. Women in their 20s or early 30s, living alone or in vulnerable circumstances, who vanished without a trace. DNA evidence and items found in Tom's house confirmed these women had been in his basement room. None of these bodies have been recovered, raising questions about where and how Tom disposed of his victims. Montana's vast wilderness provides countless locations where human remains could be hidden, remote mountain areas, dense forests, abandoned mine shafts, deep ravines. Search teams have investigated several locations based on Tom's known travel patterns and property he owned or had access to, but so far without success. It's possible the secret of where these women are buried died with Tom's cooperation, which he refuses to give. Tom Anderson remains in Montana State Prison, confined to a single cell 23 hours a day for his own protection. Prison officials report he's been a model inmate, causing no trouble, following all rules. He spends his time reading, particularly history books and westerns. He doesn't receive visitors and has declined all media interview requests. Prison psychologists who've evaluated him describe him as emotionally flat, showing no remorse for his crimes and no interest in discussing them. He's become what he perhaps always was: a cipher, a person whose inner life remains opaque even to professionals trained to understand criminal psychology. The families of Tom's other confirmed victims have found some measure of closure in his conviction, though like Patricia Mitchell, they struggle with the absence of remains to bury. Jennifer Hartley's mother, Susan, attended every day of Tom's trial, sitting 3 rows behind Patricia Mitchell. After the verdict, the two women embraced, sharing a grief that only those who've lost children to violence can truly understand. "We're in a club nobody wants to join," Susan said in a later interview. "But at least we have each other. At least we have answers, even if they're not the answers we wanted." The Blackfeet Nation, whose member Crystal Begay was among Tom's victims, issued a statement following his conviction. "Crystal was a daughter, a sister, an auntie, and a member of our community," the statement read. Her disappearance in 2015 was another painful example of the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis that has plagued our communities for generations. We are grateful that her killer has been identified and will spend his life in prison, but we will not rest until Crystal and all our missing relatives are brought home. Crystal's case highlighted the jurisdictional complexities that often hamper investigations involving Native victims. She disappeared from Browning, on the Blackfeet Reservation, but Tom Anderson was not a tribal member and the crime occurred off reservation land, meaning the case fell under state jurisdiction. The initial investigation in 2015 had been hampered by communication gaps between tribal police, the FBI, and Montana state investigators. It was only after Tom's arrest in Sarah's case that Crystal's disappearance was definitively linked to him through DNA evidence. The Montana Missing Indigenous Persons Task Force used Crystal's case to advocate for better coordination between jurisdictions and more resources for investigating cases involving Native victims. "Tom Anderson operated for decades, targeting vulnerable women," said Task Force Coordinator Maria Redhawk. Crystal Begay disappeared in 2015, 9 years before he was caught. If there had been better communication and data sharing between agencies, if MMIP cases had been given the priority they deserve, Crystal might still be alive. That's something we have to live with, and something we're working to change. In 2025, the Montana legislature passed the Sarah Mitchell Act, which requires law enforcement agencies to preserve all biological evidence from unsolved violent crimes indefinitely and mandates periodic review of cold cases using the latest available forensic technologies. The law also appropriates funding for genetic genealogy analysis in qualifying cold cases and establishes standards for the use of such technology to ensure both effectiveness and respect for privacy concerns. Detective Sarah Chen, who broke the Sarah Mitchell case, has become a national advocate for the use of genetic genealogy in cold case investigations. She regularly speaks at law enforcement conferences, trains other investigators in the technique, and consults on difficult cases around the country. "Sarah Mitchell's case changed my career and my life," Chen said in a keynote address to the National Organization of Parents of Murdered Children. "It taught me that time doesn't erase truth. Evidence doesn't expire. And justice, no matter how long delayed, is always worth pursuing." The psychological impact on Bozeman's community has been profound and lasting. Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. Therapists in the area reported a significant increase in anxiety-related appointments in the months following Tom's arrest, particularly from people who'd known him or lived near him. The idea that a serial predator had lived among them for decades, had been welcomed into their homes and churches, had seemed so utterly normal, shattered fundamental assumptions about safety and the ability to judge character. We teach our children about stranger danger, but most violence doesn't come from strangers, said Dr. Michael Torres, a psychologist at Bozeman Counseling Center who treated several people affected by the case. It comes from people we know, people who've gained our trust. Tom Anderson was a master at appearing trustworthy. He did all the things we associate with being a good neighbor. That's what makes his crimes so psychologically disturbing. It forces us to question our own judgment and realize that the masks some people wear are essentially impenetrable. The church Tom attended for over 20 years held a special service after his conviction, offering counseling and support to congregants struggling with the revelation. Pastor David Klein, who'd known Tom for 15 years, delivered a sermon about the nature of evil and the limits of human understanding. "I baptized Tom Anderson," Klein told his congregation, his voice breaking. "I broke bread with him. I thought I knew him. I was wrong. And if a pastor, someone trained to minister to souls, can be so thoroughly deceived, then we must have humility about our ability to know anyone's true heart. We must also have grace for ourselves and each other as we process this betrayal." The case has been studied extensively by criminologists and forensic psychologists trying to understand how offenders like Tom Anderson evade detection for so long. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, a criminal profiler who reviewed the case for an academic paper, noted several factors. Anderson lived alone, which meant no intimate partner who might notice inconsistencies in his behavior or whereabouts. He was self-employed, giving him flexible hours and no co-workers to track his movement. He cultivated a specific reputation for helpfulness and reliability, which made people less likely to view him with suspicion. He targeted women who lived alone and wouldn't be immediately missed for at least several hours. And he operated in a state with vast wilderness areas where bodies can be hidden effectively. All of these factors combined to create nearly perfect conditions for a predator to operate undetected. The question that haunts investigators is whether there are more victims beyond the 5 confirmed cases. The photographs found in Tom's basement showed 12 different women, but only 5 have been identified. Who were the other 7? Were they victims who died, or were some women who survived encounters with Tom and never reported them? The FBI has published photos, with faces obscured, of jewelry and personal items found in Tom's house, hoping someone will recognize an item and come forward. So far, 3 additional women have been tentatively identified based on items, but confirming their connection to Tom requires additional forensic work that is ongoing. One of the most chilling aspects of the case is how Tom inserted himself into the investigation of Sarah's disappearance. This is not uncommon among certain types of offenders who derive pleasure from observing the aftermath of their crimes and the suffering they cause. Criminal psychologists call it injecting themselves into the investigation. Tom attended vigils, joined search parties, comforted Sarah's mother, all while knowing exactly what had happened. This behavior suggests a high level of narcissism and enjoyment of manipulation. "He was playing a game," said Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Tom after his arrest. "He knew he'd gotten away with it, and he enjoyed watching everyone search fruitlessly. Comforting Patricia Mitchell, telling her they'd find Sarah, that was him savoring his power over the situation. These aren't crimes of passion or impulse. They're crimes of control, and the control extended well beyond the moment of the murder itself. The impact on law enforcement has been significant as well. Several officers who worked Sarah's case in 2005 have expressed guilt that they didn't identify Tom as a suspect at the time. We interviewed him, he was right there in front of us, and we didn't see it," said former Deputy James Martinez, now retired. "I've asked myself 1,000 times if there was something we missed, some question we should have asked, some instinct we should have followed. But the truth is, he gave us no reason to suspect him. He seemed genuinely concerned about Sarah. He had no criminal record. There was nothing to indicate he was anything other than what he appeared to be." Detective Marcus Reeves, the original lead investigator who kept Sarah's case file on his desk even after retirement, died in 2023, 1 year before Tom's arrest. His daughter, Amy Reeves Patterson, said her father never stopped thinking about Sarah Mitchell. He had her picture on his desk at home, Amy said. He'd pull out the file every few months and go through it again, hoping to see something he'd missed. When he got sick, one of the last things he said to me was, "I failed that girl. I wish he'd lived long enough to know they caught the guy. It might have given him some peace." The technological breakthrough that solved Sarah's case has created a gold rush of sorts in cold case investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country are now re-examining old evidence, submitting biological samples for genetic genealogy analysis, and solving cases that had been dormant for decades. The technique has proven particularly effective in cases from the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, periods when DNA evidence was collected but technology to analyze small samples didn't yet exist. However, the use of genetic genealogy has also sparked debate about privacy and the ethics of using genetic information from people who never consented to law enforcement access. When someone submits their DNA to a service like GeneMatch, they typically do so to find relatives and learn about their ancestry, not to help police solve crimes. Yet their genetic information can be used to identify their relatives who may be suspects or victims of crimes. Some privacy advocates argue this constitutes an unreasonable search, while law enforcement and victim advocates contend that solving serious crimes and bringing closure to families justifies the practice. Montana addressed these concerns in the Sarah Mitchell Act by establishing guidelines for when genetic genealogy can be used. The law limits its application to violent felonies and missing persons cases, requires judicial approval before uploading DNA profiles to public databases, and mandates that any familial matches found through the process be confirmed through traditional investigative methods before charges are filed. These safeguards are intended to balance the powerful investigative potential of genetic genealogy against legitimate privacy concerns. The economic impact of Tom Anderson's crimes on Bozeman has been subtler but real. The city's reputation as a safe, idyllic mountain town was tarnished by the revelation that a serial killer had operated there undetected for decades. Real estate agents reported that some potential buyers, particularly families with young daughters, expressed reluctance about moving to the area after the case made national news. Tourism, a major part of Bozeman's economy, saw a slight dip in late 2024, though it's unclear how much was attributable to the Anderson case versus other factors. But the community has worked to reclaim its narrative. The Bozeman Daily Chronicle ran a series of articles highlighting the city's response to the crisis, the improvements made in law enforcement procedures, and the resilience of residents. "We're not defined by Tom Anderson," wrote editor Margaret Sullivan in a front-page editorial. "We're defined by how we responded when we learned the truth. We're defined by the volunteers who searched for Sarah, by the investigators who never gave up, by the community that came together to support the victims' families. Evil visited us, but it didn't conquer us." The memorial to Sarah Mitchell at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital has become a site of pilgrimage for people affected by violence and those working to prevent it. Visitors leave flowers, handwritten notes, and small tokens. A common theme in the notes is gratitude that Sarah's case was solved and hope that other cold cases will also find resolution. One note, left by a woman whose sister disappeared in Oregon in 1998, read, "Thank you, Sarah, for helping prove that they can still be caught. Your case gives us hope." The nursing scholarship in Sarah's name has evolved beyond simply providing financial assistance. Recipients are now required to complete a project related to trauma-informed care or violence prevention as part of receiving the scholarship. These projects have ranged from creating educational materials about recognizing signs of domestic violence to developing protocols for emergency departments to better serve sexual assault survivors. In this way, Sarah's legacy actively contributes to preventing future violence and supporting victims. One scholarship recipient, Elena Vasquez, who graduated in 2025, chose to specialize in forensic nursing, inspired directly by Sarah's case. Sarah Mitchell's DNA under Tom Anderson's fingernails is what caught him 19 years later, Vasquez explained. I want to be someone who collects that evidence, who makes sure it's preserved properly, who gives future investigators the tools they need to solve cases. If I can help one family get justice the way Sarah's family finally did, it will be worth it. The question of why Tom Anderson did what he did may never be fully answered. He's refused all requests for psychological evaluation beyond what was legally required for his trial. He's written no confessions, given no interviews, offered no explanations. The glimpse into his psychology comes only from his actions and from the physical evidence found in his house. Investigators discovered journals in Tom's basement, written in a simple numerical code that was quickly cracked. The entries were clinical, almost procedural, describing his crimes in detached language devoid of emotion. There was no expression of guilt, no rationalization or justification, no evidence of internal conflict. He wrote about his victims the way someone might write about a project or hobby, noting what worked and what didn't, what he might do differently next time. The complete absence of empathy or recognition of his victims as human beings was, in the words of one investigator who read the journals, the most disturbing thing I've encountered in 25 years of law enforcement. The journals revealed that Tom had been fantasizing about capturing and controlling women since his early 20s. His first actual victim, based on the journals, appeared to be a woman he referred to only as L, who he claimed to have killed in 1983 in Wyoming, long before he moved to Montana. Investigators are working with Wyoming authorities to identify possible matches to missing persons cases from that era, but after more than 40 years, the trail is extremely cold. What emerged from the journals was a portrait of someone who viewed other people, particularly women, as objects to be possessed and controlled. Tom wrote about selecting victims, watching them, learning their routines, planning how to approach them. He described the basement room he built specifically for this purpose, how he'd soundproofed it, how he designed the drainage system. The level of premeditation and planning was staggering. These were not crimes of opportunity or passion. They were carefully orchestrated by someone who'd been perfecting his methods for decades. Dr. Manning, the criminal profiler, noted in her analysis that Tom's ability to compartmentalize was extraordinary. He could be the helpful neighbor, the church-going community member, and the brutal killer without apparent cognitive dissonance, she wrote. This suggests a profound disconnect between his public persona and his private self, a level of dissociation that allowed him to maintain both identities simultaneously without one contaminating the other. This is consistent with certain personality disorders, particularly psychopathy, where the individual has a limited or absent emotional connection to others and can therefore treat people as objects without experiencing guilt or empathy. The families of Tom's victims have formed a support network, meeting periodically to share their experiences and advocate for better support systems for families of missing persons. They've lobbied successfully for legislation improving how missing persons cases are handled, including requirements for more prompt action when adults are reported missing and better coordination between jurisdictions. "We can't bring our daughters back," said Susan Hartley, Jennifer's mother. "But we can work to make sure other families don't have to go through what we went through. We can make sure police take these cases seriously from day one, that evidence is preserved, that families are kept informed. That's Sarah's legacy and Jennifer's and all the others. They're still making a difference." Tom Anderson's former neighbors continue to grapple with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the man they knew with the man who was convicted of multiple murders. Margaret Foster, who lived next door to Tom for 12 years, said in an interview, "I keep thinking about all the times I left my teenage daughter alone at home while I ran errands. Tom was always outside, always friendly, always offering to keep an eye on things. Now I realize he wasn't being neighborly. He was watching. He was evaluating. My daughter could have been one of his victims. That thought keeps me awake at night." The psychological term for what Bozeman's residents experienced is betrayal trauma, a response that occurs when someone we depend on for support or safety violates that trust. In small communities like Bozeman, Where people rely on informal networks of mutual aid and neighborly cooperation, betrayal by a trusted community member can be particularly devastating. It calls into question not just one relationship, but the entire social structure that makes community life possible. Counselors working with affected residents have focused on helping them rebuild trust selectively and appropriately without becoming paranoid or isolating themselves. The goal isn't to trust no one, explained Dr. Torres. It's to understand that while most people are trustworthy, some aren't, and it's important to maintain appropriate boundaries and listen to our instincts. Many people who interacted with Tom Anderson reported afterward that they'd sometimes felt vaguely uncomfortable around him but had dismissed those feelings because he seemed so nice. We need to give ourselves permission to honor those instincts. The case has also sparked discussions about the nature of evil and whether it can be recognized or predicted. Are people like Tom Anderson born with something fundamentally different in their psychology, or do they develop these tendencies through experience? The nature versus nurture debate in criminal psychology doesn't have a clear answer, and Tom's background offers few obvious clues. Tom grew up in Miles City, Montana, the only child of a hardware store owner and an elementary school teacher. His childhood was reportedly unremarkable, no known history of abuse, no family dysfunction, no early behavioral red flags that anyone remembers. He was described by former teachers as quiet, polite, and forgettable, a B student who caused no trouble but made no particular impression. After high school, he attended Montana State University for 2 years, studying business, before dropping out and working various construction jobs. He moved to Bozeman in 1989, purchased his house in 1990, and gradually established himself in the community. Nothing in his background obviously explains what he became. This is frustrating for those seeking to understand and prevent future offenders. If Tom Anderson was an apparently normal person who became a serial killer without any obvious warning signs, what hope is there of identifying others like him before they harm someone? Dr. Chen, the forensic psychiatrist, offered a nuanced perspective. The truth is, we may never be able to predict with certainty who will become a violent offender. What we can do is create systems that make it harder for offenders to operate undetected. Faster response to missing persons reports, better forensic technology, more communication between jurisdictions, mandatory preservation of evidence, these are all things that increase the likelihood a perpetrator will be caught. We may not be able to stop the first crime, but we can work to ensure there isn't a second, or a third, or in Tom Anderson's case, a fifth. As of 2026, Tom Anderson remains in Montana State Prison. At 73, he's among the oldest inmates in the facility. Prison health records, obtained through public records requests by journalists, indicate he's in declining health, suffering from diabetes and heart disease. It's unlikely he'll live long enough to complete his sentence, a fact that provides little comfort to the families of his victims. I don't care if he dies in prison next week or 20 years from now, Patricia Mitchell said before her own death. He had 19 more years of life than Sarah did. That will never be fair, no matter what happens to him. The empty plot next to Patricia Mitchell's grave, meant for Sarah, remains empty. Sarah's body, along with those of Jennifer Hartley, Rebecca Tanner, Amanda Price, and Crystal Begay, has never been found. Periodic searches continue when new information comes to light or when technology advances enough to justify re-examining areas previously searched. But Montana is vast, over 147,000 square miles, much of it remote wilderness. The women could be anywhere. Some family members hold out hope that Tom will eventually reveal where the bodies are hidden. They've written him letters, pleaded with him through intermediaries, offered forgiveness in exchange for information. Tom has never responded. His lawyer, appointed by the state for his appeal, which was denied in 2025, reports that Tom has explicitly instructed him never to negotiate on this issue. He knows where they are, and he's chosen to take that secret to his grave, the lawyer said. I've asked him to reconsider, explained how much it would mean to the families. He's simply not interested. Whether that's because he enjoys maintaining control even from prison, or because there's some other reason, I can't say. He won't discuss it. This final act of cruelty, the refusal to allow families to recover their loved ones' remains, may be Tom Anderson's last exertion of control. In death, as in life, he maintains power over his victims, preventing their families from achieving the closure that a burial might provide. It's a reminder that even behind bars, convicted and powerless in a legal sense, some offenders continue to victimize through their choices and their silences. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Tom Anderson will continue to resonate in Bozeman and beyond for years to come. It's become a case study in criminology courses, a cautionary tale in forensic science programs, and a touchstone in discussions about how communities respond to violence. The case demonstrates both the possibilities of modern forensic science and its limitations. It solved a 19-year-old murder, but it couldn't prevent that murder or the others that followed. It identified a killer, but it couldn't find the victims' bodies. It provided answers, but not all the answers families needed. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Sarah Mitchell's case is about the importance of never giving up. Patricia Mitchell never stopped searching for her daughter, never stopped advocating for justice, never stopped believing that one day the truth would emerge. Detective Sarah Chern took on a cold case that had been dormant for nearly 2 decades and pursued every possible lead. Forensic scientists developed technologies that seemed like science fiction just 20 years earlier. All of these efforts, sustained over years and decades, eventually converged to provide answers. Sarah Mitchell mattered, Detective Chern said at a victims' rights conference in 2025. She mattered when she was alive, working as a nurse, caring for children. She mattered when she disappeared, and her community came together to search for her. She mattered during the 19 years her case was cold, because we held onto the evidence and kept her file active. And she matters now, in the justice that was finally served and the changes her case inspired. Every victim matters. Every case matters. Time doesn't change that. We prove it by never stopping, never giving up, never letting their memories fade into silence. In Bozeman, on cold December nights when snow blankets the streets and the temperature drops below zero, some residents still think of Sarah Mitchell. They think of her walking to her car after her shift, bundled against the cold, tired but content, looking forward to going home to feed her cat and rest before her next shift. They think of how that simple, ordinary moment became the beginning of a nightmare. They think of how a trusted neighbor betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. And they think of how, against all odds, 19 years later, justice finally found its way through the darkness. Sarah Mitchell's story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to resilience, to the power of science, to the importance of community, and to the stubborn persistence of those who refuse to let evil have the final word. In the end, Tom Anderson's secret was exposed. His carefully maintained mask was torn away. And Sarah Mitchell, the young nurse who just wanted to help sick children and live a quiet, ordinary life, became a symbol of something larger, the insistence that every life has value, every victim deserves justice, and every truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually come to light. The families of Tom Anderson's victims, those who've been identified and those still unknown, continue their vigil. They wait for news of new searches, new leads, any information that might help them find their loved ones and bring them home. They draw strength from each other and from the knowledge that Sarah's case was solved against all odds. If it could happen for Sarah, they tell themselves it can happen for others. And in hospital pediatric wards, in nursing schools, in homes across Montana and beyond, Sarah Mitchell's name is spoken with respect and remembered with honor. Not as a victim, though she was one, but as a dedicated nurse, a beloved daughter, and an unwitting catalyst for change. The scholarships awarded in her name, the legislation passed because of her case, the cold cases solved using techniques refined through the investigation of her murder, all these represent ripples spreading outward from one terrible December night in 2005. Tom Anderson tried to erase Sarah Mitchell. He failed. Her memory endures, her impact continues, and the justice she received, delayed though it was, stands as a promise to all victims. You will not be forgotten. You will not be left behind. And those who harm you will eventually answer for what they've done, no matter how long it takes, no matter how well they hide, no matter how convincing their masks may be. The big sky country of Montana stretches endlessly above Bozeman, just as it did on that December night 19 years ago. The mountains stand silent and eternal. The snow falls and melts and falls again with each passing season. The city grows and changes, new people arrive, old ones depart. But some things remain constant. The commitment to justice, the bonds of community, and the memory of a young nurse who deserved so much more than she received, but whose legacy now helps ensure that others might be protected, that other families might find answers, that other long-buried truths might finally see the light of day. In the end, perhaps that's all we can ask of tragedy, that it not be meaningless, that something good emerge from something terrible, that the worst moments of human nature inspire the best responses of human community. Sarah Mitchell's story is far from the ending any of us would have chosen, but it's an ending nonetheless, and one that affirms a simple truth. Justice may be slow, justice may be difficult, justice may take decades to achieve, but justice, when pursued with determination and supported by community and enabled by science, can and will prevail.